This is the Long Island Traditionalist, restoring sanity one podcast at a time. I know at first hearing this statement that some of my viewers may be scandalized by my title for this podcast. I know what some may be thinking. There are some who don't go to religious houses of worship. Certainly they're not religious. I would wager that they are. It comes down to how you define words like religion and worship. In this podcast, I intend to do this. If religion is not limited merely to a commonly understood house of worship, then one must ask, where else can it be found within the larger culture? Finally, if we are all worshiping something, even if it's not the same thing, we need to ask ourselves, will what we worship not only be true, but will it make us truly happy? These are all inquiries I am going to set out to address in this podcast, hopefully letting my experiences giving a better understanding to where I'm coming from. When I was a child, I was very reserved. I had a handful of friends, and that was about it. My free time was spent largely playing video games and creative pursuits fitting for that age, yet which I could do more or less alone. I read books and was on the computer a lot. Eventually people in my family got the cable internet, and so my fixation on the computer increased. When I got into my middle teen years, though, through a rather rude wake-up call, and reflecting on what I had to show for myself up to that point, I wanted to undo a lot of what I had been doing up to that point. And as it is nearly inevitable to happen with a teenager, sometimes things went into excess. When I was in high school, I became restless about the need to become popular with my peers. I did enjoy the fruits of that for about a year in my junior year of high school. But then when I went into my senior year, the realization of the vanity of popularity became apparent. Also, in my senior year of high school, up to sophomore year of college, I had dabbled around in various pleasures, predominantly through substances. Nothing hard, but still abusing substances. During this time, I attempted, in an on and off manner, to gain weight and build physique, as well as health, having a preoccupation with my body image. By the time I graduated from community college in 2009, I then moved on to a desire to cultivate political power and the accumulation of wealth. I proactively spent a lot of time with others in grassroots efforts in a larger movement happening throughout the country at that time. It was the Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty and subsequent Tea Party movement, as well as Occupy Wall Street. I spent a lot of time in ideologies in my college years to give myself for a cause. Undergirding this was a thirst for knowledge, at first for the purposes of power, but then for love's sake. Enter summer 2011 and Easter 2012. I came back to being an observant and zealous traditional Catholic, seeking to subordinate, purify, and order all other desires to the faith, and the rest is history. So what does my past have to do with this podcast? Well, in describing my 26-year life story up to this point, you heard me use phrases like, my free time was spent, fixation, restless need, went to excess, abuse, predominates, preoccupation, desire, proactive, give myself for a cause, subordinate, purify, and order all other desires. And shockingly enough, all these phrases either are in themselves or point to the religious impulse in man, and all these things happen to me as they happened or are happening to you and everyone else because we are searching for one thing, lasting happiness. According to The Holy Sacrifice of the Mass by Reverend Dr. Nicholas Gear, religion is a special moral virtue which enables and inclines the will to give God honor and adoration to Him, and sacrifice is the supreme act of this virtue. Worship comes from the Old English word worthshipe, which translates more properly to worthiness, as in what you hold to be most worthy. This same word is tied to the Latin word cultus, which means cultivation or care for, from which we derive the words cult and culture. A cult is not necessarily negative, although in our contemporary association it's become synonymous with evil. Rather, a cult is understood as a pattern of ritual behavior in connection with specific objects within a framework of spatial and temporal coordinates. The negative cult can only occur when something truly unworthy is erroneously determined to be worthy of worship. Now, a culture, then, is, according to the Cambridge English Dictionary, the way of life, especially the general customs and beliefs of a particular group of people at a particular time. So if God is not determined to be worshipped, but something else in his place, this then can be a religion, albeit distorted, whereas something else is given the honor and adoration due to God. What we worship, that is, what we determine to be worth our time and energy in a willful way, can and does take the form and force of a religion. Oftentimes, that which we willingly sacrifice a lot for can be a sign of where the religious impulse can be found leading us. Now, to be sure, I use the phrase willingly sacrifice, and particularly the word willingly, to demonstrate a distinction, because the same way our mind loves and tends toward the truth, or what it perceives as true, so the will loves and tends toward the good, or what it perceives as good. Therefore, it's what we are willing to sacrifice and what we are willing to determine as worthy of our time and energy that matters, not what necessity demands or forces of us. If a man is a workaholic, it's because he's addicted to his work. But if a man is merely working a lot, not because he likes it, but because he has to, then it's the workaholic who made a religion out of his work. With this definition in mind, let us now explore the cause for why everyone today has an implicit religion, even if they don't know it. The reason that implicit religious expression is on the rise in our day and explicit expression is decreasing and discouraged stems, I think, from a culture riddled with the thoughts of postmodernism, which, as I said elsewhere, is not postmodern at all, but rather hypermodernism. Postmodern thought is built on the premise of rejection, specifically the rejection of the absolute and a dogmatic embrace of pluralism, where one path is just as valid as the next. The problem here is a problem of contradiction. To be dogmatic is to make absolute statements, but absolute statements are not allowed in this concept. So to make demands of accepting a plurality of positions and treating each equally as true is, ipso facto, not allowed either. So postmodern thought is self-refuting. Another problem with the rejection of absolutes is the problem of rejecting the notion of something possessing a nature, and so an inherent identity that can't be contradicted, even if it tries to. The notion of being honest with oneself can't exist in this concept either. So what's my point? How does this relate to everyone having an implicit religion? Well, it comes down to the fact that stability is rejected. In terms of the psyche, that means identity loses its form and cohesion. In terms of a larger group, it means the development of tribes based not on fixed things like race or age or nationality, but shifting things like ideas, preferences, lifestyles, and subcultures that one identifies at one moment and changes the next. In a word, with the rejection of the stable absolute, people no longer see and are united by the one thing which makes the many things possible, but rather are blinded and lost in a sea of the nearly infinite combinations of the many. They are chained to the many. How? Recall earlier what I said about this philosophy. It is all about the rejection of the absolute and a dogmatic embrace of pluralism. If an absolute is a dogmatic statement, then to dogmatically embrace the plurality is to ipso facto embrace plurality absolutely, which is self-defeating. But people do not see this. They see the plurality, but not how they are chained to it. And if they are not careful, they will become so assimilated to it that stability will be lost. In some sense, the notion of schizophrenia or dissociative disorders, even myopic obsession, can set in. Now, if this is the case on the individual level, what happens when this is applied to the societal level? Well, since society is the sum total of individuals in it, the more who embrace this idea, the more society will tend to dissociate even from itself, fracturing into smaller tribes, no longer united to the larger whole. Depending on what the tribe wants and centers its life upon, such can affect others outside the tribal circle in a complementary, neutral, or adverse way. When we look at the situation of our society today, there are a variety of polarizing issues which stem from ideology, and which I mentioned briefly in my own life. Some by now want me to give examples of what I consider to be religious expressions in our increasingly secular society. This is a fair enough request. I shall briefly consider 10 with you that we can see in our society today. However, I remind you that these are implicit religious expressions. These are things that can very well escape our conscious considerations. Number 1. Feminism. A religious impulse of our time, if ever there was one. It involves the exaltation of the feminine. It is not merely equality, but the overpowering against the masculine. Third-wave feminism in particular is a cult, equipped with a culture and observable tribal boundaries, demanding the adoration of rather than cherishing of women. The religious ritual of feminism is found in the use of contraception, something which flies in the face of femininity. The house of worship for the ideological second and third wave feminist is Planned Parenthood, whose offices are just as sterile as this tribe. Number 2. LGBT is another example, especially as it relates to the militant types. This has yet another culture and tribal identity associated to it. The tragedy to this group is that it puts the value of human beings on their sexual attractions rather than on something more. Coming out has all the trappings of baptism. When people say someone's church shouldn't determine who I marry, I retort saying, yet your religious fixation on orientation forces bakers to bake you a cake, even when they disagree with your choices. Number 3. Environmentalism. An environmentalism that has greater concern for the earth at the expense of fellow human beings is most specifically what I mean. Today you can find it most especially in animal rights activists who would do violence toward those who hurt animals, but don't bat an eye when human babies are aborted. There are also those who find humanity and civilization to be a cancer and would love to sacrifice these things for the sake of Gaia. It's not hard to see the religious impulse once one starts calling Earth by a name used in Greek mythology. Number 4. Health and fitness. I speak particularly to gym culture. You hear it so clearly when people say, half-jokingly, the gym is my church. But we see it in those who become so absorbed into it that they can't think beyond physique but neglect their actual health. Sometimes taking up a diet requires religious dedication to succeed, and we know that this is a lifestyle with its own culture that is different when you're in the gym than when you come out of the gym. Number 5. Off-the-grid survivalism. In order to have the courage to overthrow the usual life we live, to embrace an off-the-grid lifestyle requires religious dedication and belief. A veritable cult of this lifestyle is found oftentimes in the doomsday prepper. But even in things harmless related to this lifestyle, like the minimalist lifestyle, are similar in their implicit religious impulse. One sacrifices a lot in their life for these changes. Number 6. Atheism. This one is undeniable. It is a metaphysical position, and because it is an essential part of how we see the world, you can believe the religious impulse will have some pull here. Of course, most atheists have a God. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's very explicit. Either way, that God of the atheists is an adoration of flawed human reason. Oftentimes, the more militant ones can be found worshipping a beaker through the veritable cult of scientism, wherein their high priesthood is the scientist. And let's not forget that they do gather together to worship, even if the concept is nothingness itself. Number 7. The self. If you look on Facebook and all those social media sites, you'll quickly be bombarded by selfies and memes designed to aggrandize yourself. All things must be sacrificed on the altar for me, in particular for my self-esteem, for my self-concept, for my feelings, my opinions, my wants. I've said in a previous video that the soul of a man is like a mirror, and what you put in front of it, he'll become that. So what happens when you're in those mirror houses at the carnival? They're designed to distort reality and disorient you. You become lost in a sea, and because you're still changing, you're lost in yourself with zero stability, what I referred to earlier as navel gazing. Mass consumption is number 8. Sex, drugs, rock and roll, and customization. While sex, drugs, and rock and roll have technically been with us for ages now, it was only in our own time that this concept had been articulated like that, and it's exactly because of its proliferation, its increase in availability to levels previously unknown. Each of these standing alone has its own veritable religious impulse. Sex is obsessed over constantly on media, and it's easy to access. Drugs are celebrated or glorified in the media, while a genre of music is very particular, and starting a band requires a level of religious commitment. How about our desire to imitate our celebrities, a pantheon of living gods, or a secular communion of saints, if there ever was one? Let's not even start with consumer culture. It's part and parcel with the religion of selfism, especially in our incessant demands for customization and personalization, to aggrandize our self-esteem and sense of power. A veritable sacrament of the consumer is the credit card. His church is the store or the shopping malls. Conspicuous consumption and affluenza are part and parcel to appease ourselves and impress others. Number 9. Pantheism. Probably something that tries hard to be spiritual, but in reality is still very materialistic, is the New Age movement. In fact, New Age thought has a lot in common with the postmodernism that allows for it to be exotic and cool in rejecting dogmas. Never mind the fact that one still has to adopt new ones, since the mind, like nature, who they ultimately worship, abhors a vacuum. It is no surprise that New Age thought of constructing your own religion fits so perfectly with the religion of selfism, since the self is part of nature. Finally, we come to number 10. Electronics, devices, games, and the internet. If this isn't apparent by now, I don't know what is. How many people are actively attached to their smartphones, to Facebook, to the latest game or gadget? How many let the whole day pass by while being immersed in the internet? Electronics can provide solitary connectivity and the illusion of an active life, the illusion directed at oneself and others. By now you may notice that I provided 10 concrete, sensible, and particular examples. But behind all these examples are immaterial and universal concepts that we are desiring, which we want to embody in our own lives. Aristotle wrote of these ultimately as 4 reducible human ends in his Nicomachean Ethics. Those 4 were pleasure, honor, wealth, and power. Consider the examples I made above. You can see at least one, if not all 4, reflected in these ends that Aristotle makes reference to. You'll probably notice that in our day, the religious impulse gets expressed in a myriad of lifestyles and ideologies. They can all be summed up under some manifestation of pantheism and selfism. The problem here is its undetectability, its implicitness. Yet do not be deceived. When one of these become the operating principle in that person's life, the religious impulse is orchestrating that gravitational pull. Do not be deceived also. The exaltation of the creature through pantheism and selfism exposes one to the interconnectedness to all creatures, but rather than allowing this awareness to liberate the person, it instead enslaves you. G.K. Chesterton once said, "In truth, there are only 2 kinds of people, those who accept dogma and know it, and those who accept dogma and don't know it." I wager with a quote like that, you can direct that religious impulse in you, but unwillingness to admit that religious impulse exists in you simply because you may not explicitly go to a house of worship means you will be found among those who will accept dogma and not know it, which means you will have an implicit religious expression somewhere in your life unconsciously guiding you. C.S. Lewis, in his book The Abolition of Man, would write saying, quote, the Tao, which others may call natural law or traditional morality, or the first principles of practical reason, or the first platitudes, is not one among a series of possible systems of value. It is the sole source of all value judgments. If it is rejected, all value is rejected. If any value is retained, it is retained. The effort to refute it and raise a new system of value in its place is self-contradictory. There has never been and never will be a radically new judgment of value in the history of the world. What purport to be new systems or ideologies all consist of fragments from the Tao itself, arbitrarily wrenched from their context in the whole, and then swollen to madness in their isolation, yet still owing to the Tao, and to it alone such validity as they possess." Close quote. I recommend reading the book Christ, the Eternal Tao by Hieromonk Damascene, since Jesus is considered the way, and Tao means way, and is a very similar concept to Logos, which we get the phrase the word from. What is the point of me sharing this, though? To point out that in the midst of these tribal and implicit religious expressions found in our increasingly secular society, they are fragmentations from the larger true and good found in the Tao, which C.S. Lewis made reference to. You cannot kill the religious impulse in man. Like energy, it merely changes and is directed elsewhere. So to pick 5 of those 10 examples of implicit religious expression, let's see if we can briefly reintegrate them into the larger whole. Number 1, feminism, which falsely and ideologically demands women be worshipped and treated as if they were men, has truth and goodness in the fact that women should be respected, seen through a lens of complementarity rather than identicality, and not objectified for the perverse caprice and malice of others. Modesty on the part of women and their demand for chastity from others is the first consistent move of reintegration after admitting these facts. Number 2, atheism, which falsely exalts flawed human reason and nothingness, demanding that science alone is omniscient. It has truth and goodness in the fact that a well-formed human reason can understand many things with and without the help of science specifically, but it can admit that it does not nor cannot know everything, and that the intelligibility of being demands a greater intelligence which is omniscient. Receptivity, openness, that is faith, to something greater than yourself operating through creation is the first step along the way to reintegration after admitting the facts above. Food and health is number 3, which falsely exalts the cultivation of the body to an obsessive degree, in the hope of treating it like it was going to last, and giving it the same treatment that we ought to give our souls, which will actually last, has something true and good to it. We need to recognize that well-rounded health has more importance than obsessive concern for physique. For the Christian, he is called to realize that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit and should neither be spoiled nor neglected to the detriment of the Spirit. Temperance, or moderation, must be acted upon by cultivating health first in the form of good habits and being all right with whatever physique comes from that. Number 4 is pantheism. This one is a little more abstract, but its concrete expression is found in the New Age movement, which falsely exalts the natural in order to give it more pseudo-spirituality, while demanding the relinquishing of dogmas in the name of obtaining the power of God, rather than being in union with the God of power. This is probably the most inverted of all the implicit religious expressions in our time, as it is all about the overthrow of the supernatural by the natural, of primordial order by revolution, thus making whatever seeds of the truth and goodness very difficult to redeem. Therefore, humility must be lived out in order to bring about reintegration. The humility to accept the fact that the self-serving pseudo-spiritualities are inauthentic to the spirit, and in the recognition that one has not rejected dogmas, but merely picked up new ones. Only upon doing so can one look back in hindsight at what was true and good during their time in the New Age thought. Finally, number 5. The self. Again, like pantheism, it is also a bit inverted as it places self over and against God. In fact, it tries to absorb God into itself by making it merely the highest form of the ego. However, even in the midst of this, there is some truth and goodness here. We are built to receive, only to give away what we have been given. Selfism doesn't complete the loop. Therefore, in order for reintegration into the larger whole to occur, not only must there be humility, since pantheism worships nature as God, and self is a high manifestation of nature, but there also needs to be greater generosity, greater willingness to give away that which you have been given for the well-being of others, regardless of who they are to you, and that is what love is. Our Lord, Jesus Christ, who is wisdom incarnate, who is the eternal Tao, would go on to say, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." That's from the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 12, verse 34. As well, he would say, "I am come that they may have life, and have it more abundantly." That is from the Gospel of St. John, chapter 10, verse 10. Commentary to the first quote would add, saying, quote, "For every man naturally dwells upon that which is the object of his desire, and thither he directs all his thoughts, where he supposes his whole interest to rest. If any one, then, has his whole mind and affections, which he calls the heart, set on things of this present life, he lives in earthly things. But if he has given his mind to heavenly things, there will his mind be, so that he seems with his body only to live with men, but with his mind to have already reached the heavenly mansion." Close quote. Eusebius of Caesarea. Commentary from the second quote would go on, adding to say, quote, "By going in they have life, that is, by faith, which works by love, by which faith they go into the fold. The just live by faith. And so by going out they will have it more abundantly. That is, when true believers die, they have life more abundantly, even a life which never ends." Close quote, St. Augustine. So if these fragmentations of the true and the good are treated as if they were the whole truth and goodness, this leads to what the ancients called idolatry, which St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica defined as what happens when one unduly gives divine honor to a creature. That is, he's calling it a vice opposed to religion, or a false religion. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, said the four ends of man are pleasure, honor, wealth, and power. Ultimately, these are means to an end for our sanctification or damnation. In themselves, they are neutral. The moral question is not should we have these things, but rather how do I use these things in relation to God, in relation to my neighbor, and in relation to myself, with whatever degree I may possess them. Idolatry, or false religion, and virtually all the implicit religious fixations of our time make us treat these four Aristotelian ends as ends in themselves, cut off from the larger whole. True religion, when willingly and consciously embraced, sees these only as a means to an end, namely, the glorification of God and the sanctification of souls. In the end, these implicit religious expressions exist like never before exactly because no modern man ever made the connection between man's natural thirst for the true, the good, and the beautiful on one hand, and how God is those very things for us. Part of the reason for that failure was the belief that the only people called to the spiritual heights were those who are called to priestly or religious life, thinking that sainthood somehow was not for them. But this is a lie. In truth, God calls all of us to the spiritual heights, and as St. Augustine, a model for those who feel unworthy, wrote in his Confessions, quote, "Thou movest us to delight in praising thee, for thou hast formed us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they find rest in thee." Close quote. That is from his Confessions. In the end, one has a choice: to choose the one thing that matters, and to put the many things beneath you, or to get absorbed in the countless many things, mimicking the infinitude of the one thing through their nearly countless recombinations, only to find the many is over you and the one thing forgotten. All I know is that it was the demonic who said through a possessed man before Christ, "We are legion." Indeed, how enslaved are we when we give ourselves over to a multitude of creatures thinking they will fulfill us, but never will. Such is the definition of Stockholm Syndrome. This is the Long Island Traditionalist. May the Lord bless us, protect us from all evil, and bring us to everlasting life. Amen.